In our kind of tour of Ukrainian history, we're now at the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So, if my memory of reading about it serves, this would be the last day of 1990. They lower the Soviet flag and raise the Russian flag.
Yes.
And all of a sudden, we have an interesting situation where we've gone from just the Soviet Union having nuclear weapons to now Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan all having Soviet nuclear weapons in their territory. And from a non-proliferation perspective, this freaked out pretty much the whole international community, certainly the United States, Russia, and others. And there began to be a push for Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine to give up their nuclear weapons. Why don't you take it from here?
Sure. Yeah. That effort. That whole period of history. We usually remember it as just the Budapest Memorandum. And you see, Ukraine was really in an interesting point, from what I understand, in post 91, where it's a brand new kind of nation. It's trying to reel from its Soviet past, and suddenly they're left with this huge nuclear arsenal. I don't remember the exact numbers. I think it was somewhere 3,000 to 4,000 nuclear missiles that they kept from the Soviet Union. They also kept other huge Soviet stockpiles. I'm sure Ukraine was right, somewhere at the top where it came to military power. It was really huge. And that certainly became a point of tension because, like you said, in the aspect of nuclear proliferation, that definitely scared a lot of people, saying, oh my God, this is a small little country. Can they manage 3,000 nukes? And for Ukraine, that's definitely an interesting question back then to look back at and even talk about and think about is, where was Ukraine? And is this something that they could have handled? And, from my understanding, Ukraine was not in that economic position where they could maintain such a large nuclear stockpile. And it's reasonable to say back then, with the fact that there was some degree of corruption, that it was probably not the safest to keep all those nukes there. I don't want to say that Ukraine was necessarily forced to give them up, but even I think the Ukrainian government back then really understood that it was probably for the better, especially economically, because 3,000 nukes is a huge economic burden.
It's interesting because Kazakhstan wanted nothing to do with the nuclear weapons. They immediately gave them to Russia, even without a political process.
Right.
Belarus, I don't know the details, but there was not hard persuasion. But Ukraine started down this path and then got cold feet, and Clinton had to go. And there was this fear that Ukraine would face pressure, or that Ukraine would be a victim to Russian aggression for parts of its territory or all of its territory, which was some incredible foresight. People already knew back in the early 90s that this was a possibility. So this brings us to the Budapest Memorandum of 94, in which certain major powers, including the United States, the United Kingdom, Russia, France, and China, all gave Ukraine security assurances. And they all promised not to attack Ukraine, not to use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, and different kind of language about consulting and supporting. Now, all these countries signed this agreement, but no one ever thought the UK or France was going to invade Ukraine. All eyes were on Russia.
Right.
And this is sort of an interesting moment because, on one hand, the State Department lawyers were very careful to make sure that this was not a security guarantee. Nowhere in the Budapest Memorandum does it require America to, defend Ukraine militarily. However, in terms of the spirit of the document, it was a clear political commitment. This is absolutely the United States putting its political credibility on the line, saying, we want non-proliferation, we don't want the spread of nuclear weapons, and in some sense, we got your back here, including militarily, even if, yes, it was not a, mutual defense treaty or something of that level, but it was very much a political commitment to support Ukraine against any future Russian aggression.
No, I definitely agree with that. And I think the Ukrainian, government at the time probably realized that. And I think that that was enough of a assurance to them to take such a gamble, most likely, because again, there was definitely some incredible foresight, and I think that the fear of Russian aggression really isn't as unreasonable or as, they didn't just kind of predict the future. There was already, even shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, we really already saw like the fangs of Russian imperialism acting out. We have examples in the early 90s and up until the later 90s where Russia really started to, show its force out there. I remember even in Moldova with what was the little separatist Transnistria. There we go. Yeah, that we already saw, and I think it was reasonable for the Ukrainians to be scared of Russian aggression back then, and I'm sure it wasn't easy to give up the nukes because they are a security guarantee for Ukraine, but it probably was not possible for Ukraine to simply be able to maintain such an arsenal. And there was definitely...
Maybe not the whole arsenal.
Yeah, maybe not the whole arsenal.
But I have really mixed feelings here, because on one hand, I think nuclear non-proliferation is something that basically unites all human beings.
Yeah.
These are the kinds of things that even in the worst of times, the great powers can usually agree on. Yeah. And I agree. I think the future of life on this planet rests on non-proliferation. The day you can buy a nuclear weapon at Walmart will be the last day on this planet.
Yes.
But I also have really strong feelings about hundreds of thousands of dead Ukrainians.
Yeah.
I don't know how to balance that. The Budapest Memorandum was held up as this triumph of non-proliferation, of really showing countries that you don't need nuclear weapons to be safe.
Right.
And 100,000 plus dead Ukrainians later, I think, yeah, it seems different now, doesn't it?
I'll say this to that. It's easy to look back and say, why did we do this? Why did we give up the nukes? But at the same time, I think, again, we just agreed that nuclear proliferation is something we can all agree on, and I'm pretty sure even Ukrainians can agree on that, because at that point of the world, I don't think anyone was really thinking that there would be such conflicts that would happen in the future, and that we're going into a place, into a future where you don't need nukes to be safe. And I think Ukrainians definitely bought into that, and honestly, reasonably so. Like at that point, I'm pretty sure it seemed like a reasonable decision. It's one of those things we can look back with hindsight and say, okay, maybe it was a mistake, but really was it at the time, as people understood the state of the world? Maybe not. I don't think it really benefits anybody to go back and say, should we have kept the nukes or not? I think we should more look at it as what happened after that, to where suddenly not having nukes was not enough of a security guarantee. What happened with Ukraine, with Russia, and just generally the state of the world, to where this kind of conflict, this kind of invasion was able to happen?
Yeah, I think that's definitely one question that needs to be asked, and including from a Ukrainian perspective. Yeah. But from an American perspective, the question I want to ask is, what do we owe Ukraine? Because I'll tell you, I feel the debt. As an American, we went to this country and applied the pressure of, American economic and European economic and other kinds of pressure. And I don't think it ever came to, direct threats or anything. But there was a time where Clinton had to tell the Ukrainian president that, well, if you don't, it's going to severely damage your relationship with the United States. So let's all be honest here. We're all among friends. U.S. pressured Ukraine and gave security assurances. So I think when people ask me, well, why should the U.S. be involved? Don't get involved in other countries, these kind of specious comparisons to Iraq. There's so many reasons, and we'll get into them. But the reason we're on the Budapest Memorandum is the foundational reason is that we promised. And even if you're like, well, break your promise, whatever, so sorry, presumably the United States in the future will need to make more promises and have them trusted. And to have abandoned Ukraine, and thank goodness we didn't, totally flies in the face of everything that Clinton said, everything the United States said. It flies in the face of the spirit of the Budapest Memorandum. And yes, you can parse it just so to show that U.S. doesn't technically have, this or that obligation. But I think in terms of American credibility and the credibility of future nuclear non-proliferation efforts, we must support Ukraine.